You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Liquid IV. In heart-pumping moments, you need hydration that can keep up. That's where Liquid IV comes in. Scientifically formulated to quickly replenish electrolytes and fluids lost from your well-earned sweat session. Hydrate your favorite mode of movement with Liquid IV, made with triple the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 vitamins and nutrients. Also available and sugar-free. Tear, pour, live more. Visit liquidiv.com to learn more.
I am a father of a soon-to-be 9-year-old girl. In 2020, she was delighted to learn that a half-Indian woman was going to be the vice president of the United States. Not just because she is half-Indian herself, and she could therefore see herself, her ethnic identity, reflected in the nation's leadership, but I think even more so because it meant that she, as a girl, could one day rise to such a position, could attain that kind of respect, that kind of admiration, and could influence the world. A few years into the Biden administration, when she was in first grade and turning 7, she learned that we had never had a woman president. And according to her teacher, she got very upset over this, raising her voice and expressing outrage at the unfairness of it. When she eventually asked her mom and me why there had never been a woman president, we had to try to explain misogyny to her, which is a rather devastating idea to convey to a child, much like telling a child about racism. We told her that in other countries there are women presidents and leaders, but we didn't tell her that even today, only 2% of elective democracies in the world currently have a woman as chief executive, and less than 5% have ever raised a woman to executive office. Nor did we tell her that the first woman to achieve such a governing position did not do so until 1960 in Sri Lanka. Nor did we tell her that most female prime ministers and presidents only achieved their positions within the last few decades, since the 1990s. We explained that it is unfortunately rare, and that this is not because women are not qualified or capable of being leaders. We told her that the year she was born, a woman almost did become president, that more people voted for her than for the man who ran against her, but that the man became president anyway. And last year, we shared her deep frustration when, again, a woman came very close to the presidency. Any who might deny that misogyny was a decisive factor in the recent election, I would like to remind that a prominent aspect of the right's rhetoric during the campaign was that any male who voted for a woman should have their quote-unquote man card revoked. Regardless of anyone's support of Trump or ambivalence over Democratic Party leadership, I think anyone who looks at the state of women in leadership throughout the world should agree, if they are honest with themselves, that America is far behind the rest of the world in this regard, and that the reason for this is a deep-seated sexism and misogyny in our culture. While the list of countries who have promoted women to the highest executive office represents only a fraction of all democracies, they are, by and large, the most developed countries, which rank highest on the Human Development Index. In other words, failing to promote a woman to executive office reflects poorly on our country, making us more like developing countries. Likewise, many countries who have had women executives place higher on the Democracy Index, while the USA has experienced a democratic backsliding in the last 20 years, being considered now a quote-unquote flawed democracy. But pathetically, even among modern neo-fascists bent on undermining democracy, the US is still behind in the promotion of women to the highest office. Take, for example, Italy, a country recognized for culturally deep-rooted misogyny and sexism. Recently, their own neo-fascist party succeeded in putting a woman, Giorgia Meloni, into the office of prime minister. Granted, she is a longtime Mussolini-praising fascist, leading the country's first far-right government since World War II. But doesn't this just prove that America is even further behind in gender equality than we might like to think? If even a far-right authoritarian movement in one of the world's most deeply misogynist countries has promoted a woman to executive authority. How deeply does misogyny and sexism run in Italy? It is most obvious to credit it to the cultural influence of the Catholic Church, but I would take it further back to the Roman Empire. My recent episode about Elagabalus demonstrated this. At its heart, it was a story about the accidental raising of a woman to the highest seat of power in Rome, and the controversy over her politically empowering other women. And now, to further illustrate the long history of misogyny and sexism that Italy is today managing to slowly tame, which should shame the US and inspire us to follow suit, I'd like to tell another story related to Rome and Italy, this time about the Catholic Church, a tale about the time they accidentally promoted a woman to the church's highest position of authority. It so happens that this story is entirely untrue, but still it demonstrates the very old roots of misogyny and the notion that even the idea of a woman in power was long considered a joke. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and it seems to me that if one needs a man card to reassure themselves of their masculinity, they are clearly insecure about their gender identity. Thank you for listening to The Legend of Joan, Popess of Rome. Before we continue, I want to thank my newest patrons. Thank you, Nikki, Rune Lee, Marcia Bowen, Laura F., and Ernie Garcia. Thank you to all of my patrons. I love researching and writing this program. I'm proud of it, and I find it fulfilling. But it's still the financial support of you patrons, far more than the meager ad revenue I bring in, that makes it possible for me to devote as much time as I do to the podcast. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on Aspasia, I released a long minisode about the poetess and queer icon Sappho. And after my episode on trans Roman empress Elagabalus, I released one that traced the practice of meteorite worship through history, further arguing that it was not Elagabalus's religious reforms that turned Rome against her. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. I originally was going to time this episode for release around April Fool's Day. I thought that it would be funny to have a cold open telling the legend of Pope Joan as if it were true, only to reveal it for a myth. The timing for an April 1st release didn't work out though, and after the last time I did that with the topic of the Lost Kingdom of Tartaria conspiracy theories, I found that it's maybe not a great idea to present false information as if it were true at first, even if I take pains to refute it later, as I found that my material could be taken out of context to support falsehoods and perpetuate myths. Nevertheless, since I see some thematic connection to my recent take on Elagabalus, and since the office of the Pope and the process of the election of new popes has been in the news, I still think it a good time to explore this story. Just last year, a political thriller about the papal conclave, the convening of cardinals for the selection of a new pope, earned many accolades. And earlier this year, Pope Francis was hospitalized with double pneumonia. We are only now learning how very close he came to passing away. His recovery is being hailed as miraculous. Had things gone another way, though, the College of Cardinals would gather in conclave, as the recent film depicted. After numerous rounds of balloting, when a cardinal has accepted their election, they choose their papal name, are dressed in the pontifical robes, and are proclaimed. A blessing is imparted and crowds are addressed. In the past, there was a more formal coronation ceremony, but since the 1960s, new popes have declined such pomp and circumstance. And there exist legends and rumors regarding the former ceremonies involved in the coronation of a new pope. Starting in the late 8th century, after their proclamation at St. Peter's, a new pope traveled in procession across Rome to take possession of the Lateran Palace. And there, on the porch of the Lateran, it is said that a special chair was set with a hole in its seat, on which new popes settled in their robes, so that the, quote, least of the deacons, end quote, could reach beneath and confirm that the new pope did indeed possess male genitalia. And the reason for this ceremony, it was claimed in a legend that flourished throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, was that once, in the 9th century, a woman disguised as a man had accidentally been elected pope. This woman, during one procession across Rome, unexpectedly gave birth and died in the streets. Ever since then, it was said, the procession of popes avoided that detested spot in their processions, and the institution of a genital check had been made necessary to ensure that no woman would ever again fool the cardinals and get herself elected pope. It is a wild story, and one attested as absolutely true for so long that it has been difficult for scholars to refute. Nevertheless, it is entirely false. The story, as it developed, was that after Pope Leo IV, an apparent man named John, or Johannes Anglicus, of English extraction but born in the German Rhineland in Mainz, came to Rome by way of Athens and impressed the entire church with broad scriptural knowledge, brilliant interpretations of scripture, and impressive oratory. This Pope Joan reigned about 2 years, and the legend at first mentions nothing controversial about the reign or this pope's actions, except that one day while on procession, he was revealed to be a she when suddenly she went into labor and died, quote, upon the place, end quote. While some accounts make it sound as if she died in childbirth, the earliest of these accounts state that upon the revelation of her true sex, she was bound, dragged through the streets behind a horse, and stoned to death, as per Roman law. Some of these accounts mention various pieces of evidence for this event. One was the papal procession's avoidance of a certain spot, quote, a narrow passage between the Colosseum and San Clemente, end quote, supposedly because they wished to avoid the spot where Pope Joan revealed herself to be a woman and died, or was killed. Another was the statue of a mother and child on a street corner near that place, which was said to depict Pope Joan, as she was thereafter called. Third, a certain gravestone was said to bear 6 P's, said to stand in Latin for the sentence, "Refrain, Father of the Fathers, from publishing the parturition of the Popess," end quote. Essentially a plea for the erasure of Pope Joan and the hushing up of this embarrassing incident. Fourth, the quote-unquote pierced chair, or porphyry seat at the Lateran, formerly part of the papal coronation, stands as perhaps the most prominent and convincing physical evidence of a tradition to confirm the sex of the Pope. And finally, it was claimed that Pope Joan was responsible for the Fast of the Four Times, the quarterly periods of fasting and prayer, more commonly called Ember Days today, which would mean that she had a profound legacy within the Church just from her 2 short years as Pope. A closer look at each of these claims, however, only proves that the story of Pope Joan is entirely legendary. First, I think it's necessary, after my discussion of Elagabalus as a trans woman, to explain why I will use feminine pronouns to talk about a figure who apparently lived as a man, as far as can be determined by the different versions of legend as it was repeated and spread. Pope Joan was not living as a man because she preferred it. Rather, it was said that her lover took her to Athens dressed as a man, suggesting some kind of disguise for the purpose of spiriting her away. Nevertheless, one might suggest that she chose to continue presenting herself as a man because it reflected her gender identity. But there is a further reason that she could only progress in her studies and in the church if she was believed to be a man. And the further motivation for continuing the charade that she might face execution, being stoned and dragged through the streets if she were ever found out. Regardless, the simplest and most pertinent reason that I refer to Pope Joan as a woman is that this is how the legend is transmitted, and we have much reason to believe that there is not an actual person upon whom the legend was based, meaning there was, therefore, no actual once living individual whom I might be misgendering. To clarify the first and most prominent reason why the story of Pope Joan is considered a myth, the story was not told until the 13th century, hundreds of years after it supposedly occurred. It was first put down in writing by Dominican friars who appear to have taken the details of the story from each other's writings. But before their accounts, there was nothing. No documentary evidence of Pope Joan's existence from the 9th century has ever turned up, and there is ample evidence that Pope Benedict III directly succeeded Pope Leo IV within the very same month, from contemporary records, datable letters he wrote, and a credible contemporaneous biography in the Liber Pontificalis. Moreover, the contradictions and variation of the details presented in the earliest versions of the legend also make them dubious, with the mysterious gravestone not appearing in some versions, others excluding any biographical information about where Joan had come from, and some claiming she was murdered in the streets, while others suggest she simply died on the spot. But beyond these doubts regarding the provenance of the claim, the many proofs suggested within the legend also turn out to be false. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now, you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
It's back to school season and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Now, back to the show. Historians and researchers have looked into every one of the claims put forth in the medieval legend of Pope Joan, and each is found to be less than convincing. So, for example, there is the claim that papal processions always avoid a certain location at San Clemente, because that is where Pope Joan revealed her true sex by giving birth. It has since been proven that formerly the path taken by the procession, the Via San Giovanni, dead-ended at San Clemente, which necessitated a detour, taking the procession around the dead end. So the path of the procession veered left onto Via dei Corcetti. Only in later years was the street extended through San Clemente. By that time, the path of the papal procession had been made a tradition. So rather than avoiding a certain spot, it simply continued taking the path previously taken. In the 12th century, the path of the procession actually did change, turning right instead of left onto Via dei Corcetti. But rather than to avoid the previous path or the newly opened path, this was likely because of the narrowness of the other routes. And only later was the street renamed Vicus Papis, Village of the Popess, after the legend of Pope Joan had become popular. Likewise, the statue of the mother and child said to have been nearby was probably only later said to have something to do with this legend. Numerous writers have stated that they saw this statue, erected on a street corner opposite San Clemente, including Martin Luther, who claimed to have seen it as late as the 16th century. However, descriptions of the statue make it sound like a depiction of the Madonna and Christ child, if not a pagan mother goddess from Rome's antiquity. But we must view this logically. If Pope Joan went into labor and died on the spot, then her child likely died at birth, making the depiction an unusual choice. But even more strange is the idea that the Roman Catholic Church would have allowed such a statue to be erected and stand for so long there, commemorating a pope who, according to the story, they wanted forgotten. Therefore, the most logical explanation is that when this legend began circulating in the 12th century or early 13th century, after the papal procession path had changed and before the written accounts of the legend appeared, some hoaxer stood at that street corner and spun the humorous tale that the real reason the procession's path had changed was because of the lady pope. Haven't you heard the story? We can imagine them telling others. That's a statue of her right over there, in fact. And thus an urban legend was perpetuated. Similarly dubious and illogical is the claim that there exists a gravestone marking Pope Joan's grave. First of all, again, only some versions of the legend mention this gravestone, and there's good reason to doubt that even those who mention it, like Etienne de Bourbon, had ever actually seen it for themselves. There is further reason to doubt, as in the case of the statue, that the Catholic Church would mark the grave of a pope they had put to death for supposedly evilly tricking her way into the papacy, or that, if they did choose to mark her grave, it would be with a cryptic and kind of cheeky code. Roman gravestones were commonly marked with abbreviations, but it wasn't a kind of code that people had to figure out, guessing what the acronym might mean. Rather, they were marked with common repeating acronyms. In the case of a gravestone with 6 P's, it has been suggested that if it existed, it was more likely the base for a statue of Mithras, since that god was commonly called Father of Fathers or Pater Patrum, or that if it did mark a grave, it was the grave of a follower of Mithras, and the inscription more likely stood for Parce Pater Patrum Pecunia Propria Posuit, or Have Mercy, Father of Fathers, paid for with his own money. That last phrase, also translated erected at his own expense, was a common gravestone abbreviation of 3 P's, indicating who had paid for the monument. In contrast, the other explanation seems to have been entirely dreamed up by those who spread the Pope Joan legend. So yet again, we have this idea that as the urban legend spread in Rome, some prankster pointed to a very common gravestone inscription and reinterpreted it as evidence of Pope Joan's existence and the covering up of her memory. Perhaps most outrageous is the claim that popes after Joan were made to sit in a bottomless chair and have their testicles fondled to ensure their manhood. It has been suggested that this legend confuses 2 different chairs. One is the sedis stercoraria, which in Latin means dung chair. A new pope would sit on it and be told, quote, "May he lift up the poor man from the dust and raise up the poor man from the dung, and may he sit with princes and hold the seat of glory," end quote. In seating the pope while others stood and talking of him serving the poor, the ceremony was meant to emphasize humility. This seat was not perforated for the checking of genitals. However, it does appear that starting in the 11th century, Pope Pascal II began to use a perforated chair as a throne during coronation. This was a short-lived practice, but one of these chairs, which was carved from expensive porphyry stone, survives today in the Louvre, brought back to Paris by Napoleon after his sack of Rome. Now, these chairs were clearly crafted to serve a specific purpose, with a hole in the seat opening toward the front of the chair. Some scholars have suggested they were bathing chairs or birthing chairs, or even toilet chairs. And historians debate what their purpose was in the Lateran Palace. Some claim they were used as the sedis stercoraria, further humiliating new popes by emphasizing that they too are mere men and must defecate. Others suggest, since they were made from porphyry, which in antiquity was a material that could only be owned and used by the imperial family, that these chairs were rare artifacts, perhaps the chairs in which emperors were born and bathed, and therefore it was considered to impart some sort of imperial authority onto popes. If they were used only as thrones then, Perhaps they served as a sort of status symbol. Still others assert that they were merely toilets on which popes relieved themselves. Regardless, we know that the sedis stercoraria was part of the ceremony long before the supposed reign of any Pope Joan in the 9th century. And we know that the Roman porphyry latrine chairs were not in use long, despite continued claims that this ceremony was still taking place. For example, in the 17th century, an anti-Catholic Lutheran writer, Lorenz Bonk, traveled to Rome and wrote a description of the coronation of Pope Innocent X, and he claimed these chairs were still in use, including an illustration of a deacon reaching under the chair from an opening on the side to check the Pope's manhood. Clearly, though, these chairs, which were no longer in use by that time, didn't even have an opening on the side. So the legend of Pope Joan continued to be spread into the early modern period simply as ammunition to attack the Catholic Church. Indeed, even the fact that this supposed manhood-checking ceremony has not been practiced for a very long time has been used as a barb to hurl at the Church, for it was then claimed that such a confirmation was no longer needed because since that time, popes tended to sire so many illegitimate children that their manhood was never in question. Many theories have been put forward as to how this legend of a female pope might have originated. One theory has it that the story refers to the 9th century Pope John VIII, saying he was considered quote-unquote womanly for giving in to the Patriarch of Constantinople and reinstating him after his excommunication. In truth, though, John VIII only did so in his efforts to enlist Byzantine aid in expelling the Saracens from Italy. Today, he is considered to be a strong and able wartime pope who did his best to defend Rome against incursion. But he was unpopular enough in his own time to be assassinated by his own clerics, poisoned and clubbed to death, not unlike the version of the Pope Joan story that has her murdered and dragged through the streets. Others suggest that the Pope Joan story was based on the prophetess Theoda, a woman from East Francia who developed a large following in Mainz, the very place where some versions of the Pope Joan legend claim the she-pope came from. She drew followers with a prophecy that the world would soon end. But loath to accept the growing influence of a woman in the church, clerics had her publicly flogged until she recanted her prophecy, confessing under torture that she had been paid to make the claims. Here we have an actual woman in the church being turned on and attacked in the 9th century, but she wasn't killed and she came nowhere near the papacy or Rome. The connection here seems to only be the locale from which it was said Pope Joan hailed, though this detail did not appear in all the written versions of the legend. Still others point to the Saeculum Obscurum of the 10th century, also called the quote-unquote pornocracy, or the rule of harlots, when an influential noble family, the Theophylacti family, manipulated and controlled the selection of popes. Some women in this family were said to have held a special influence over papal selection. Theodora was supposedly the lover of Pope John X and was rumored to have been instrumental in his election to the papacy. Her daughter, Marozia, was said to be the lover of Pope Sergius III, and Marozia's son with this pope was later elected Pope John XI. Therefore, it is suggested that the legend of Pope Joan, a story about a pope named John that was really a woman in disguise, was a commentary on these women's secret power over the papacy, as reflected in the several Johns they put into power. Another Pope John related to Marozia was John XII, who was something of a philanderer. It was said one of his mistresses was named Joan and had a great influence over him, making her the supposed inspiration of the legend. So the time of the pornocracy, we see, was rich in potential origins for this tale. And lastly, there is the suggestion that the entire tradition grew out of the quote-unquote 4 times, the days of fasting and prayer that some versions of the legend suggested Pope Joan had instituted. These 4 times, now called Imber Tides or Imber Days, are quarterly seasonal celebrations. The word imber here is believed to have derived from the Latin quatuor tempora, 4 times, and their establishment as Catholic fast days are yet another example of Christianity's adoption of pagan celebrations, which they adapted to their own purposes. These 4 times were agrarian holidays in pre-Christian Rome, and it is just false to claim that any pope in the 9th century established the 4 times festivals as times of fasting and prayer, for the papal biographies in the Liber Pontificalis indicate that they were adopted as fasting days as early as the 3rd century. But it was Alain Borot, the French scholar whose research into the Pope Joan legend is unparalleled, who theorized that the 4 times celebrations in pre-Christian times likely involved an element of misrule. The Saturnalia festival certainly did, and since one of the 4 times Imber days falls in December, there may have been some overlap. This element of misrule meant a topsy-turvy theme in which the poor and lowly were elevated over the rich and powerful, when men dressed as women and women as men. Thus, the notion of a woman dressed as a man being elevated to the highest position and also being associated with these festivals suggested that the entire legend may have derived from the sort of inverted social order celebrated in them. What is sad is that despite advances in women's rights through the centuries, it seems that in many countries, including the US, the idea of women in leadership is still considered by too many to be an inversion of the social order. As the legend developed in the 16th century, the anti-Catholic writers in the Reformation claimed it was real, all of it. And like any conspiracists, they claimed that any lack of evidence was the result of a cover-up, of Pope Joan being expunged from the records. These Protestant polemicists pointed to the idea that women might have an influence in the church, or that priests might be effeminate, as reasons to despise and reject Catholicism. They even went so far as to start new legends, including one that Pope Joan was not only a woman, but a witch who wrote a grimoire teaching the practice of sorcery. In this way, the legend of Pope Joan became a lightning rod for sexism and misogyny through the ages. In its retelling, it was almost always told to make a point about how catastrophic and terrible it would be for a woman to be raised to power. It was presented as an example of women's deceptive nature, even though the story illustrates very clearly how neither Joan nor any female was able to achieve anything without the deception of presenting themselves as a man, since they were, by their very sex, denied such opportunities. And in the end, it is her very body that betrays her, a powerful symbol of how the ability to bear children has always been what leads men to subordinate the female sex. And so it remains even today, with maternity affecting the standing and opportunities of women in workplaces everywhere, and with women in so many places, and now since the repeal of Roe v. Wade throughout the US too, losing control over their own bodies, and therefore over their own lives, just like the fictional Joan, whose unexpected pregnancy meant losing everything she had worked for, even her very life. And any who doubt the depths of sexism and misogyny in America today should just look at our recent presidential election, when a qualified and capable woman, a sitting vice president, lost to a convicted felon, an adjudicated rapist, a proven pathological liar, a blatant racist, an authoritarian oligarch, a belligerent nationalist, a nativist, a fascist, In short, the most un-American candidate in U.S. history, who after fomenting an insurrection should, under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, be disqualified from holding office. Obviously, there were issues in play other than the sex and gender of each candidate, but many political analysts do suggest that it was sexism and misogyny that cost Kamala Harris the election. And with her polling strongly ahead with women and substantially behind among men, it's hard to argue otherwise. Consider, after all, the rhetoric in the media over whether Kamala Harris and her clothing choice of pantsuits, quote, looked presidential, end quote. This seems to have just been a thinly veiled assertion that only men have the look of a president, especially when known misogynist Donald Trump claimed that, quote, she didn't look like a leader, end quote. One wonders if she would have fared better had she just, like Pope Joan, hidden her biological sex and lived as a man. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. You can find blog posts for each episode on historicalblindness.com that contain a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT Ltd, and Jamie Nielsen. Thank you for the outpouring of supportive comments from patrons after the last 2 episodes. It encourages me to direct my efforts more and more towards speaking out in this social and political environment. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, I leave you with the words of one early promoter of the Pope Joan myth, quote, "Behold to what an abominable end such rash presumption leads," end quote. He, of course, was talking about the presumption that Pope Joan really was a man. But out of context, I think it's an apt quote to describe the unfortunate results of blindly crediting myths and pseudo-history.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.